For decades, the most valuable thing Dubai sold to the world was not visible. Not the skyline, not the luxury hotels, not the gold-plated image that filled social media. It was something far more powerful. Safety. An invisible guarantee that no matter what was happening across the Middle East, conflict, instability, political tension, Dubai would remain untouched. A controlled bubble in an unpredictable region. A place where risk stopped at the border and never entered the experience. And that idea became the foundation of everything. In 2025, Dubai reached one of the highest peaks in its history. Nearly 19.59 million international visitors arrived in a single year. Hotel occupancy remained above 80%, even with average nightly prices approaching 600 AED. Those numbers were not just statistics, they were evidence of belief. Millions of people were not just visiting Dubai, they were trusting it. Because when someone chooses a destination like this, they are not just paying for a room or a view, they are paying for certainty. For the assumption that nothing will go wrong, that every moment from landing at the airport to watching the skyline at night will unfold exactly as expected. And Dubai mastered that promise. It built an entire system around removing uncertainty. Airports that functioned like precision machines, hotels that operated without friction, experiences that felt insulated from the outside world. It wasn't just luxury, it was control. And that control allowed Dubai to do something very few cities can achieve. It turned perception into an asset, a currency, a reason for people to choose it over anywhere else. Because in a world that feels increasingly unstable, a place that feels predictable becomes incredibly valuable. But that value comes with a hidden condition. It only exists as long as the perception holds. Because safety, unlike infrastructure, cannot be reinforced physically. It is not something you can build taller, or expand, or upgrade. It is something people must believe, and belief has a threshold. It does not disappear gradually, it breaks. And when it does, the system that depends on it begins to change almost immediately. Because Dubai was not just built on sand, it was built on an idea. The idea that risk could be controlled. The idea that instability could be excluded. The idea that in this one place, everything would always work. But ideas do not collapse when they are questioned. They collapse when they are contradicted. And that contradiction was coming. On the night of February 28, 2026, the contradiction arrived, not as a gradual change, not as a slow deterioration, but as a moment that lasted only minutes, yet carried consequences far beyond its duration. The sky over Dubai, once known for fireworks and carefully staged displays of celebration, was suddenly filled with something else. Streaks of light cutting across the darkness. Not decorative, not controlled. Signals of a system reacting, intercepting, responding. Missiles, drones, defense systems activating in real time. For the first time, the visual language of Dubai changed. And that matters more than it seems. Because before this moment, instability existed outside the frame. It was something people read about, something they associated with other places, other cities, and/or other systems. Dubai remained separate. Now it was visible. And once something becomes visible, it becomes real. Within hours, the effects began to spread, not physically, but behaviorally. At Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest transit hubs in the world, operations were disrupted. In a single day, 228 flights were canceled. Waiting areas that once reflected constant movement began to quiet down in a way that felt unfamiliar. At the same time, the tourism system reacted instantly. Around 8,450 bookings disappeared almost immediately, not gradually, not over weeks, in a single wave. And that is the key difference. Because this was not a reaction to long-term decline. It was a reaction to a single shift in perception. Experts began projecting broader consequences. If instability continued, like the Middle East region could lose up to 38 million visitors by 2026, representing approximately $56 billion in lost economic activity. But even those numbers do not fully capture what happened, because the real impact was not in cancellations or revenue, it was in what people saw. Images of the skyline no longer aligned with the narrative. The Burj Al Arab, once considered untouchable, appeared alongside damage and disruption. The palm, a symbol of engineered perfection, now framed against smoke and uncertainty. Luxury was still there, but it was no longer isolated, and that changes everything. Because the system was never designed to handle visible contradiction. It was designed to maintain a consistent story. A story where control is absolute, where risk is absent, where everything unfolds according to expectation. The moment that story breaks, even slightly, the system must operate under a new condition: uncertainty. And uncertainty does not need to dominate the experience to have an effect. It only needs to exist. Because once people become aware that something can happen, they begin to factor it into every decision. Should they go? Should they wait? Should they choose somewhere else instead? And when those questions begin to appear at scale, behavior changes. Not because the system has collapsed, but because the confidence that supported it has been disrupted. And that disruption does not stay contained within the event itself. It spreads through conversations, through images, through silent decisions made by people who no longer feel the same certainty they once did. Because in systems built on perception, reality is not what matters most. It is what people believe to be true. And on that night, something changed. Not just in the sky, but in the way the system was seen. Before people fully process what they feel, capital has already made its decision. Because money does not wait for certainty. It moves at the first signal of risk. And in a system like Dubai, where growth has always depended on the continuous inflow of global capital, that movement is everything. In 2025, the UAE attracted around 9,800 millionaire migrants, more than any other country in the world. Wealth was not just entering the system, it was choosing it. Choosing Dubai over Singapore, over Switzerland, over London. That choice was based on one thing: confidence. Confidence that this was a stable place to park capital. A place where assets would not just hold value, but grow. Where geopolitical risk would remain outside the equation. But after February 28th, that equation began to change. Not dramatically at first, but enough. Risk assessments shifted. Some financial analysts began placing long-term geopolitical risk in Dubai as high as 70%. And for capital, that number does not need to be precise to be influential. It only needs to be plausible. Because capital does not react to confirmed danger. It reacts to potential instability. And once that perception appears, even slightly, the response is immediate. Funds begin to reposition. Family offices, those quiet structures that manage generational wealth, start moving assets across jurisdictions. Hedge funds adjust exposure. Investment portfolios rebalance, not out of panic, but out of strategy. Because staying becomes a risk, and leaving becomes a hedge. And at the same time, financial signals begin to appear. The Dubai stock market experiences unusual interruptions. High-value retail brands, including global names like Apple and Gucci, quietly reduce operations. Not as a public retreat, but as a precaution. And that word, precaution, is important, because it reflects the mindset of capital. It does not wait for collapse, it prepares for it. The real estate sector, once one of the strongest pillars of Dubai's growth, begins to show early signs of strain. Just days before the shock, major property groups were reaching record valuations, up to 149 billion dirhams. But valuation is not the same as stability, because value depends on demand, and demand depends on confidence. Once confidence weakens, value becomes uncertain, and uncertain value is something capital avoids. This is how financial systems respond. Quietly, efficiently, without announcement. Money does not leave in visible waves. It exits in flows. A transfer here, a reallocation there, a decision not to invest, a delay in deployment. And when those decisions accumulate, the effect becomes visible only after the shift has already occurred. Because capital does not need to explain itself. It only needs to move. And when it does, the system it leaves behind begins to feel the absence. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because in Dubai, money is not just part of the system. It is the system. It fuels construction, it sustains services, it maintains liquidity, and most importantly, it reinforces the perception that growth will continue. But when that reinforcement weakens, everything else must adjust, because without capital inflow, the system cannot expand, and without expansion, it begins to reveal its limits. And that is the moment where the shift becomes structural, not just a reaction, but a transition from a system driven by confidence to a system constrained by caution. Once capital begins to hesitate, the next shift becomes unavoidable. People start asking a different question. Not, how impressive is this place? But, is it worth it? Because for years, Dubai operated in a space where price was rarely questioned. A mid-range hotel room could cost hundreds of dollars per night. Luxury suites reached far higher. Dining, transport, lifestyle, everything carried a premium. And that premium was accepted. Not because it was cheap, but because it felt justified. Because when people believed they were buying safety, stability, and a controlled environment, the price made sense. It wasn't just about what they received, it was about what they didn't have to worry about. But once that layer of certainty is removed, even slightly, pricing begins to look different. In 2026, a mid-range hotel room in Dubai still averages around $280 per night. The cost of living remains extremely high, over 90% higher than cities like Bangkok, according to comparative data. And suddenly, those numbers are no longer invisible. They become visible, because when trust weakens, people begin to evaluate value more carefully. A $45 breakfast is no longer just part of the experience. It becomes a comparison. What else could that money buy somewhere else? A full dinner in another country, a longer stay, a more relaxed experience. The same shift happens across every level. Rent, education, healthcare. Services that were once accepted as part of the Dubai premium now feel excessive when the underlying justification, certainty, is no longer absolute. And this is where the system begins to expose itself. Because the pricing was never just about cost, it was about perception. It was about what people believed they were paying for. And once that belief changes, pricing loses its anchor. Hotels begin lowering rates to maintain occupancy. Discounts appear across sectors. Promotions expand. But something unexpected happens. Demand does not return in proportion to the price drop, because the issue is no longer economic, it is psychological. Lower prices do not restore trust. In fact, they can sometimes signal the opposite, that something is wrong, that the system is adjusting not because it wants to, but because it has to. And that perception creates a loop. Lower prices attract attention, but not necessarily confidence. Because in high-end markets, value is not defined by affordability. It is defined by alignment, the alignment between what is promised and what is experienced. And when that alignment breaks, even slightly, the entire structure begins to shift. What once felt like premium becomes questionable. What once felt exclusive begins to feel inflated. What once felt aspirational begins to feel replaceable. And that is the most important change. Because Dubai was never competing on price. It was competing on perception. And once perception weakens, it enters a different kind of market. A market where comparisons are direct, where alternatives are visible, where people begin to realize that similar experiences can be found elsewhere, and often at lower cost and with less perceived risk. And this is how value collapses, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in a gradual reassessment, a shift in how people think, a recalibration of what something is worth. And once that recalibration spreads, the system must adjust. Because value, unlike infrastructure, is not fixed. It exists in the mind. And when the mind changes, everything else follows. When value begins to collapse, the final layer holding the system together is no longer financial. It is human. Because behind every functioning city, every service, every experience that feels seamless, there is an invisible structure of people maintaining it. And in Dubai, that structure is unlike most places in the world. It is not rooted, it is imported. Millions of expatriates form the backbone of the system. Professionals who manage operations, build infrastructure, run businesses, and sustain daily life. Alongside them, a much larger workforce, construction workers, cleaners, service staff, operate in the background, often unseen, but essential. This is not a traditional population, it is a mobile system of labor. And that makes it efficient, but also fragile, because mobility means optionality. People stay as long as the system works for them, and when it stops working, they leave. At the top of the structure, the movement is fast. Highly skilled professionals, engineers, executives, consultants begin to reassess their position. For them, Dubai was always a strategic choice. High income, low tax, global exposure. But those advantages depend on stability. Once that stability is questioned, the calculation changes. Opportunities in Singapore, London, Zurich begin to look more attractive. Not necessarily because they offer more money, but because they offer predictability. And predictability is what professionals value most. So they move, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. At the same time, the middle layer begins to feel pressure in a different way. Rising living costs had already stretched budgets. High rent, expensive healthcare, costly education, these were manageable when income and stability were consistent. Now, with uncertainty added, the margin disappears. Families begin to reconsider, not dramatically, but practically. Should they stay, or should they relocate before conditions worsen? And many choose the second option, because leaving early is safer than staying too long. But at the base of the system, the situation is different. And the workers who sustain the visible luxury, the ones who clean the rooms, build the towers, maintain the infrastructure, do not have the same freedom. Many earn between $300 and $500 per month. They are tied to contracts, restricted by sponsorship systems, dependent on employers for mobility. They cannot simply decide to leave. So while the upper layers of the system become fluid, the lower layers remain fixed. And that creates imbalance. Because a system like Dubai requires synchronization, the elite, the professionals, and the workers must all move in alignment. When one group exits and another cannot, the structure begins to strain. And that strain becomes visible. Service slows down. Operations lose efficiency. The seamless experience begins to show friction. But beyond performance, there is something deeper: morale. Because when uncertainty spreads, it does not only affect decisions, it affects perception. Workers begin to question their future. Professionals begin to question their investment. Residents begin to question their belonging. And that question, do I still belong here, is one of the most dangerous questions a system can face. Because once enough people begin to ask it, the system starts to lose cohesion, not through collapse, but through disconnection. A city that once felt like a coordinated machine begins to feel like separate parts moving in different directions. And that is when the system becomes unstable. Because cities are not defined by buildings. They are defined by relationships. Between people, between roles, between expectations and reality. And when those relationships weaken, the system does not immediately stop. It continues, but with less efficiency, less trust, less cohesion, until eventually what remains is no longer a fully functioning system, but a structure struggling to maintain itself. When the system begins to lose flow, capital, value, and people, the final question is no longer about performance. It is about identity. Because what Dubai is facing is not just a disruption, it is a redefinition. For decades, Dubai positioned itself as something very specific: a city of the future. A place where limits do not apply, where everything can be built, everything can be scaled, everything can be controlled. Artificial islands shaped like palm trees, skyscrapers that break world records, shopping malls larger than entire districts in other cities. It was a model based on spectacle. And for a long time, spectacle was enough. Because it attracted attention, it created desire. It differentiated Dubai from every other destination in the world. But spectacle has a limitation. It captures interest. It does not always create attachment. And in a world that is changing, that difference becomes critical. Because modern travelers are no longer only looking for what is impressive. They are looking for what feels real. Authenticity, cultural depth, a sense of place that cannot be replicated anywhere else. And this is where Dubai faces its most difficult challenge. Because much of what it built was designed to be replicated. Controlled environments, curated experiences, spaces engineered for perfection, but not necessarily for meaning. And when the external conditions change, when safety is questioned, when cost becomes visible, almost when alternatives emerge, the absence of deeper identity becomes more apparent. At the same time, competition is no longer passive. Saudi Arabia is investing hundreds of billions into tourism and infrastructure, building entirely new cities with the explicit goal of attracting global attention and capital. Qatar, after the momentum of global events, positions itself as a more stable, quieter luxury destination. Singapore continues to offer what Dubai once dominated: predictability, efficiency, and trust, but with stronger institutional grounding. These are not just competitors. They are alternatives. And alternatives change behavior. Because once people realize they have options, loyalty disappears, not out of rejection, but out of comparison. And comparison leads to redistribution of tourists, of capital, of talent. Which means Dubai is no longer competing against instability. It is competing against other forms of stability. And that is a different kind of challenge, because it requires more than infrastructure. It requires transformation. The system now stands at a crossroads. One path is continuation, attempting to restore the same model, rebuild perception, reignite demand, continue expanding, continue attracting, continue projecting the same image. The other path is reinvention, accepting that the conditions have changed, reducing dependence on external flow, building a deeper identity, creating value that is not solely based on perception but on substance. Neither path guarantees success, because continuation risks repeating the same vulnerabilities. Our reinvention requires changing the very foundation that made Dubai successful in the first place. But one thing is clear: The era where Dubai could rely entirely on illusion is ending, because the most valuable asset it ever had was not its skyline, it was belief. The belief that this was a place where money could buy certainty, where luxury could eliminate risk, where the future could be engineered. But belief, once broken, does not return in the same form. It returns slower, weaker, more conditional. Dubai will not disappear. Its buildings will remain. Its infrastructure will continue to function. Its position in the global system will still matter. But it may no longer be what it once was. Not an unquestioned destination, but a system under evaluation. And that changes everything. Because in the end, the most important question is no longer, can Dubai build higher? It is, can Dubai rebuild what cannot be seen? Trust.